Good morning. It's Sunday, March 3rd. Thank you for joining us for News 8 this week. This morning, our program will focus on the federal prison in Thompson, Illinois. While the prison saw challenges well before it saw its first inmates, we'll focus this morning on more recent history. Now, back in March of 2022, a new warden took over at USP Thomson. His name, Thomas Bergami. Now, prior to his tenure, there were problems at USP Thomson. There had been 7 deaths at the prison, and there was a litany of allegations about how inmates were treated. There were also concerns over staff safety. A Department of Justice investigation would eventually be announced in June of 2022. And not long
A lot of news articles came out that were anti-Warden Bergami and anti the Thompson administration at the time during our tenure. And it was almost a daily occurrence of mistruths that would come out of that institution where we weren't allowed to speak and put out there what the actual facts were because the agency won't let you talk as a warden in AW when you work for them.
Let's go over some of that today. In November of 2022, we reported on allegations made by the staff union that there was a systemic pattern of sexual attacks by inmates on staff. The union president also claimed that Bergami was making things worse by removing safeguards and reducing punishments for offenders. Numbers provided by the union show an increase in the number of attacks since March of 2022 when Bergami took over as warden to November of that year. Those reports made their way to federal lawmakers, including Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois and Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa. Both said they called on the Bureau of Prisons to investigate. Bergami told us he disputes those reports. Now, we want to warn you, some of the language used here is for adult audiences.
We had this entourage of all these people were all of a sudden being masturbated in front of by inmates who were behind a locked door with a window about up to your neck, John. So I found it really hard to believe that that could happen. Did it happen? A couple of times it did. And for to be quite honest with you, some inmates did it just to get attention because they were ignored. And so what the old administration would do was if they caught an inmate that was, or even heard of an inmate that was masturbating, they would cover his cell window for 90 days. Now, could you imagine being in your bathroom for 90 days and you couldn't see out the back window to outside because they painted that, they frosted it, or the front cell? You know what isolation does to people? That's behavioral dysfunction right there. So we knew there had to be inmates acted out just to get staff attention. So what happened was what we did was we looked for trends when these alleged assaults were occurring. And we found for the most part, they were on the midnight shift and the evening shift when the administration wasn't there. So what I did was I put in a procedure that staff making 30-minute rounds had to do it in pairs. So I figured they would be safer. The inmates would be less inclined to masturbate in front of 2 people, especially if one was a male versus 2. And it worked. But you know what happened? The staff hated it. And they hated it because they felt like I was questioning their integrity when it was really a safety mechanism, but they didn't want to hear safety. See, safety was, I'm not going to send you down a range in the middle of the night by yourself, and I'm going to send you with somebody else, but they didn't want that. So that was clue number 1. Clue number 2 was it was the same set of staff that were writing these incident reports alleging inmates were masturbating. And I don't know what was it, Denny, we found about the same 7 or 8 staff, and there were some males. Once they heard about a possible lawsuit, there were some males, John, writing they were, distraught and mentally abused because they saw an inmate masturbating behind a closed door. So you have to realize when you sign up in the Bureau, you are subject to arduous duty and you are subject to seeing some things. Nobody said anything when they first signed on with the Bureau. They were like, this is the greatest job ever. Then all of a sudden, when they're in, some of them were 5 years, some of them were 2 months, and all of a sudden we got all these problems and we're just so demoralized and depressed and suicidal because we saw this. And I would ask the question, John, I said, you think if somebody masturbates in the street, a policeman runs away from the crime? Or does he deal with it? Now that person might be right in front of him.
I could add, Warden, that you put a lieutenant on this specific range, or excuse me, unit that was also predominantly segregated with Black individuals, African Americans, and you put a lieutenant on there for as a supervisor to supervise it, to ensure that the two staff were making rounds according to policy.
Well, that's absolutely right, because that's the other part of it, John, is that coincidentally, the only inmates that ever were accused of masturbating there were either Black or Hispanic. There were very few, if any, whites. Now, I find that hard to believe because you've got 800 inmates and the only ones that masturbate are African American. That, I might have been born yesterday, but it wasn't last night. So a reasonable person would tend to believe that you got to investigate this more.
And our program continues when we come back. Stay with us.